Is an award-winning journalist who is currently political editor of the I paper, having moved from the Sunday Times earlier this year. Caroline has more than 20 years' experience in the press gallery and is also chair of the Women's Lobby, which involved mentoring her young female colleagues. She began her career at a traineeship at the Birmingham Post and Mail before moving on to the Sunday Mercury, the Sunday Express and the Sunday Times. Caroline won Journalist of the Year, Political Journalist of the Year and Campaign of the Year in 2024 in recognition of her work over more than 2 decades, exposing the scandal of the victims of the contaminated blood tragedy. We're going to have this session as a kind of fireside chat between the General Secretary and Caroline, but please join me in welcoming Caroline and you'll have the opportunity to ask questions at the end.
Thank you, and thank you, Caroline, for agreeing to do this. Caroline, I should say, as a journalist, I often get phone calls from journalists when things are happening. When she was at the Sunday Times, every Friday my phone would go off and it would be Caroline, almost clockwork. And it became a bit of a running theme because for some reason every time she phoned me, I was on my way somewhere on holiday or whatever. And that used to be how she opened up her question, trying to understand where I was. And on Friday she contacted me, or Thursday she contacted me, and I was on my way to Dublin for the HCPS conference, so she's got this knack of doing that. So thank you very much for agreeing to come and speak to us. And I think for us, representing the civil service, it's always interesting to get political journalists here to kind of, we see what government is like, and inevitably civil servants cannot be isolated from politics and what's going on. But it is very much a perspective from the inside of the governing party rather than the broader political forces that are at play. So it's really good to be able to talk to a political journalist about that. And what I wanted to start with, it was my birthday yesterday. I was 59. Yeah, thank you very much. You know, and I think about that, and I think, you know, I was 59, and probably for 49 of those years, politics felt pretty kind of normal. You know, it was. Obviously, there were changes back and forward. You had different governments for different periods of time, but you kind of felt that you knew the rules of the game. But, you know, it feels like for the last 10 years, Brexit has created this instability and chaos around government, including what seems to be what's happening just now. I mean, is this the new normal? Is this, when we look at what's going on just now as we speak, is this all, can be traced all back to Brexit, or are there other forces at play?
Oh my goodness. I mean, I think we all hope that this isn't the new normal, because I haven't been home before 10 o'clock any night this week. And, you know, taking on this new role at the Eye was supposed to be about getting some work-life balance back and not having to work every weekend and to actually see my children. That's not happening at the moment. So very much hope it's not the new normal. Look, I mean, I think you're absolutely right to identify Brexit as one of those moments, although actually I would take it even earlier than that. I think things have been incredibly febrile ever since we had the Scottish referendum, which obviously sort of precipitated the sort of Brexit referendum that followed it. And obviously it has marked so many different changes. And I think, you know, the instability that you talk of does come from some of those kind of broken bonds that were kind of fractured during that period. The fact that the electorate is not a kind of quite so homogenous as it used to be. It's harder to predict. You know, Labour supporters that had been rock solid for years, whose families had always voted Labour, you know, suddenly voting for different parties. You know, the proliferation of this kind of fragmentation of politics and the sort of polarisation that we've seen that's followed it has definitely added to that kind of sense of instability. But I mean, I actually think, looking at it sort of really carefully, actually COVID is the one thing on top of Brexit that I would say has led to even more instability. And I look at some of the kind of politics that we see now, is that sort of generated this sense that everybody could get something immediately. You know, that we had that situation where basically we're plunged into a pandemic. People were told that their livelihoods were at risk. And within a couple of days, you had the furlough scheme. And similarly, when we saw the war happen in Ukraine, within a couple of days we saw an energy scheme that kind of helped people with their energy bills. And so suddenly it kind of created this kind of culture, I think, or almost expectation amongst the electorate that everything could be fixed just like that. And actually, as I'm sure many of you in this room will know, that work on some of those kind of really detailed policies, like, for example, you know, energy sustainability, it's not something that can be fixed overnight. And yet the expectation of the public and of voters is that politicians can fix things pretty quickly if they've got the will and the wherefores to do it. And so we've ended up in this situation where there's a real conflict between sort of deliverism and the inability to deliver things quickly enough for a public that's absolutely insatiable for its appetite for things to change for the better, particularly in that kind of cost of living space. And populism, which is promising the world from parties that haven't necessarily had any experience of delivering things or knowing what's even possible, promising people absolutely everything and saying that they can fix everything for them tomorrow. So those two big forces of kind of deliverism and populism seem to be clashing all of the time, which just means that we're in this incredible kind of pressure cooker all of the time.
You talked there about this issue around people's voting habits change. Do you think the electorate has changed? I mean, there was that sense of, you know, I grew up in Scotland, politically it was always Labour. You know, you kind of weighed rather than counted the votes. And that has changed quite rapidly. Do you think the electorate has changed? Do you think those elements of the kind of stability around the electorate, where they lived, not just that, but those types of people voting for the same parties, has gone forever now?
It's hard to see how it comes back because, you know, if you look even at the local election results, I mean, that has shown even more than before that the normal politics is fractured, that polarisation has happened, that there is a real fragmentation of the two-party system, and that people are now more willing to vote for parties that perhaps they wouldn't have considered, you know, even a decade ago. So, you know, we've seen the kind of resurgence of the Reform Party under Nigel Farage, and we're now seeing the Greens really coming into a sort of ascendancy as well. And I think that that is what happened with Brexit. People started to vote along very different lines. You know, the parties themselves were split. You know, the Labour Party was split between those people who wanted Brexit and those people who didn't. The Conservative Party similarly so. We can see even with the kind of creation of Prosper UK, this kind of wet branch of the Conservative Party, that even now that party is split over, you know, really fundamental issues, but even as much as what the future relationship with Europe is going to look like. And I fear, and I don't want to put fear into the hearts of everybody, that we're going to have that debate around Brexit all over again. And I know that, you know, whilst there are some people in the cabinet who really want us to be bolder and more kind of sort of ambitious in our relationship to Europe, and, you know, some of those cabinet ministers I know have even been lobbying for a kind of rejoin sort of narrative to be put into the next manifesto. There are some people that want to run for the hills when that's even suggested. You know, I think Andy Burnham, if he does in fact come back to Westminster, given where he derives his power base from in those kind of red wall seats, would be really reticent to reopen that. But that is the kind of direction of travel again. So yes, I do think the kind of the voting habits have changed. If we look at young people, the Sunday Times did a really fascinating poll of young people over the summer, and what that showed was that young people are even more polarised. The young women are much more likely to be much more left-leaning. They were much more interested by the offers of people like Corbyn's Your Party, whereas young boys were much more attracted to the messages that they were seeing on TikTok and other social media from Nigel Farage's Reform Party. So I don't think this is going to be a story that's kind of just for now. I think this is going to be an emerging story as we move forward, and that's really something that the kind of mainstream political parties are going to need to grapple with and need to understand, that this is not something that's confined just to that kind of Brexit generation. This is something that's going to keep on happening.
I mean, thinking about the current government, you know, 2 years ago, they won nearly 180 majority, which most prime ministers couldn't have dreamed of. Starmer was a prime minister who had been a civil servant. He'd actually run quite a significant bit of the state. And yet here we are potentially today looking at what may end up being a challenge to him as prime minister in a government that feels like for those 2 years has kind of been in perpetual chaos. What went wrong? How did they get from that position, you know, in the days after the election to where they are now?
It's like the question we ask ourselves all the time. I mean, you know, similarly with Boris Johnson, he had a majority. We hadn't had a government with a majority for a while. You know, this government's got an even bigger majority. And, you know, there is no... But the MPs are just so frustrated that this kind of opportunity is seemingly being squandered. But I think, I mean, a senior government source said to me yesterday, you know, Keir Starmer is one of those people that if you were putting out a job spec for Prime Minister would kind of tick all of those boxes, but yet they think that he was, you know, incredibly unsuited to that role. And the kind of reasons that they put to it is, you know, a level of indecisiveness, a level of competence that just isn't there, and an inability to build a team around him. And that's what I come back to time and time again when I think about where this particular government has gone wrong. I mean, I unfortunately have been here long enough to have seen the Blair years, I've also seen the Cameron years, and I've seen what's come after that. And the best governments and the strongest governments, certainly from a kind of communications perspective, which is obviously the end of things that I come into, have been those governments where there has been a really homogenous team, like really competent people around a Prime Minister who are all pulling in the same direction. And the sense that I've always had, we were talking about it just before, that I've always had around Starmer's team is that he hasn't had that team. There wasn't a plan. There wasn't a group of people that all had a kind of just sense of purpose and sense of direction. It was all about who was up, who was down. There was a lot of egos. There was a lot of personality there. But there wasn't a kind of central, uniting, driving force that has meant that this government had a mission and a purpose, despite all the talk of, you know, I can't remember how many planks we had and plinths and missions and all of the other things. There was no kind of driving sense of kind of purpose for that government. And I think that's what's been really lacking. And I mean, I was always kind of astonished when I heard about the kind of transition arrangements, was that, you know, even when they knew for a good, 18 months that they were the party that had kind of a compelling lead in the polls, that beyond a sort of 2-week media plan, there wasn't much that sat behind that. Whereas in the Blair years, I mean, they had a plan, and they had kind of, you know, really detailed sort of plan of what was going to happen when, you know, the independence of the Bank of England announcement, or, you know, the selling of the gold, not that that was brilliant and didn't go particularly well, but, you know, they knew what they were going to do. There was a strategy, and people were sort of in play to do that. But also the kind of key members of the cabinet had kind of been with each other long enough. They kind of worked out their kind of their sort of role in the government, and it all seemed to kind of hang together much better, whereas this government has always seemed to be very kind of divided and not very united. And I think that that's something that any incoming government, if we do see a kind of change of government, I think really need to be thinking about. They've got to have a plan, they've got to have a strategy, and they've got to have the right people in jobs.
And do you think maybe it came a bit too early? I mean, there's that element. I always think when for the pre-97, you know, there was basically from about 92, 93, Labour knew they'd kind of come close in 92. There was, it felt like there was a lot of money and intellectual capital and all of that helping them prepare. Whereas, you know, basically a couple of years out from the 2024 election, Johnson was still the Prime Minister. It wasn't, you know, no one necessarily have thought there would have been a change of government at the next election. Do you think they just didn't have time to prepare, or is it just they're not very good?
I can let you say that. I mean, I personally don't think it's excusable. If you've seen the polls showing that you're going to be the next government, and, like, you know, we needed a sensible grown-up government more than anything. I mean, the country deserved a bit of stability after so much instability, and that was the message we kept hearing from them, was wait, sort of make way for the grown-ups, you know, we're coming. And the sense that I always got, you know, talking to, you know, leading members of the government in the shadows before they became sort of actual ministers, was that they just had this kind of overriding sense that just because they weren't the Tories, they were somehow going to be much better at governing. And there was almost a kind of arrogance, I think, that that they were going to be superior because they had integrity, and they were, you know, they were very much different to that, you know, old tarnished group of people in the Tories that had been, you know, ridden with scandal, and that somehow just the kind of the break and change of being new was going to be enough. And I think that that's what astonished so many of us that have been watching this, was just how quickly they got mired in scandal and the same kind of problems that that the Conservative Party did, but they didn't seem to sort of recognise that. And I remember, again, writing a piece for the Sunday Times about Saint Starmer. You know, there was this sense that because he was a kind of public servant, because he had come into politics, as he likes to remind us all the time, for all the right reasons, that somehow that made him uniquely qualified for the job and different to the Tories. And I think that's also been one of the reasons why they haven't been able to respond to the scandals in quite the way that we would expect them to, because they think they're different to everybody else. They don't see themselves as lacking the integrity that they accuse their opponents of having.
And on that, the thing I think surprised, I mentioned it in my speech earlier on, was about the kind of attacks on the civil service. I mean, when I became General Secretary, Francis Maud was the Cabinet Office Minister. And, you know, everyone would kind of clutch their pearls because he'd make a complaint about a Permanent Secretary not kind of working together around paper procurement or something. And this was an outrage that a minister was criticising a Permanent Secretary in kind of coded terms around it. And then you think about what has happened with this government and previous governments. I mean, do you think that's a permanent change as well? I mean, is this just now what the civil service can expect, that whatever government is going to come in, the kind of decades-long compact around ministers will not criticise their civil servants because they can't defend themselves has gone, and this is just the kind of new world of politics?
I think, sadly, civil servants, journalists, or everybody sees that the world is much more...
Don't put journalists and civil servants in the same category.
But it's much more volatile. I mean, people are just much more willing to attack, generally. If people see a problem, rather than being sort of polite and sort of raising it, you know, through official channels, you know, it all seems to be done in a very public forum. And the kind of aggressive nature of politics, I think, has got even worse than, you know, in the kind of really horrible days of Brexit, where it was kind of all-out war. So I do think that this kind of aggressive, you know, we were hoping there was going to be a kind of gentler politics that Jeremy Corbyn was talking about. That obviously didn't happen, and ever since then, I think, you know, it really has been the kind of gloves are off. But look, I mean, it's very fashionable at the moment for civil servants to be kind of attacked and to be blamed for things that are going wrong. And I think that that's part of the kind of culture of the kind of what I've been describing for a while as the kind of death of shame, and the fact that people don't take responsibility any longer. And if they can find a scapegoat to blame for some of the mistakes, then that seems to be what happens. And, you know, you see it even now with the kind of language of the Prime Minister, even over the course of the last few days, saying, I'm going to take responsibility for these election results. I'm going to take responsibility for, you know, for firing sort of Peter Mandelson, or for the vetting of Peter Mandelson, and all of those things. And then the next thing you see, he's fired Ollie Robbins. You know, so there does seem to be a kind of real culture of trying to sort of blame everything other than yourself, and creating that kind of other that needs to kind of take the blame for everything. But it is fashionable, isn't it, to kind of, you know, blame systems and to not take responsibility for things that you see. And I think that piece, I don't know, I'm guessing you've all seen it, that Paul Ovenden wrote, who was one of the Prime Minister's chief strategists. I'd like to say it was a couple of months ago. It was probably longer. It feels like time goes so quickly now. But he wrote a piece basically saying that there was a real problem in terms of that politicians can't pull the levers quickly enough. Well, it's down to politicians to create those levers. It's down to politicians to change the way in which systems work. And it feels unfair to me if you're blaming civil servants for not fixing those things, that's just, again, another way of kind of pushing the blame onto somebody else. But I do think that that's been something that we've seen happening more and more and more over about the past decade. You know, you see it with politicians who have hung on by their fingernails, you know, even when it's been quite obvious that, you know, the offence that they've committed is a kind of resignation offence, and yet it's gone on day after day after day after day. And in the old days, you know, they would have been out on their ear within a couple of days at the latest, but it seems to go on for weeks and weeks and weeks. And, you know, right now we're seeing that even with the Prime Minister. You know, you've seen however many MPs calling for his resignation. It sounds like there's going to be a high-profile resignation today, and yet the Prime Minister is bunkered down in Downing Street. And again, a kind of inability to see what's in front of them and actually read the room.
It's funny, on that point on levers, a minister was asking me about the kind of frustration about stuff. And I reminded them that when, you know, by this period of time, any coalition government So a government without a majority and brought together with two quite different political parties. Francis Maud had reformed redundancy arrangements in the civil service, legislated for it, and was reforming the entire public sector pension scheme. You know, saying and trying to say, you know, that was essentially a minister without a political mandate, right? In terms of that, and had done this, you know, these things, like them or loathe them, but had actually got things done. And that kind of sense of ministers feeling that they actually have an ability to do things just seems to be one of the kind of features just now. Almost they blame other people for it, but you think with 180 majority, you can actually almost do anything that you want.
Well, you would have thought so, wouldn't you?
Yeah. Right, enough from me. I'll take some questions from the audience.